So first I want to say that I want to critique my own title right away, as people do. Does sociocracy scale? I called it that because that's what people ask, right? That's the standard question. Does sociocracy scale? And I want to already say that sometimes that question gets to me a little bit because I wonder, well, that's asked like that would be a good thing. It's already making the assumption that scale is a good thing. And I don't think necessarily that that is the case. I'm just I'm just answering the question in the way that I can answer it. Like, what do we know about that? So I'm not assuming that sociocracy should scale or that organizations should scale. I'm not saying I don't know how I stand on that one, or like where I am on that one, but I just wanted to mention that little disclaimer in the beginning. So, and whenever people ask, does sociocracy scale? I always want to ask, well, what kind of scale do you mean? And that is actually what I'm going to spend most of the time with here, is just to pick apart a little bit on what kind of scale people mean when they ask that, because there's all kinds of options. And just the question, does sociocracy scale, is too simplistic of, I think it summarizes, or there are too many things in it that it can mean. So let's look at them. What kind of scale could it even be? So one thing that people might be meaning is, well, that we have a lot of different circles, like the fractal structure that sociocracy was made for, right? So we have a lot of operations in a lot of different parts, all taken care of, and that would be a large organization. Then another one would be a situation where there are a lot of circles doing similar things, and I'll explain that a little bit more. So here, each of the fractal is doing something else, and here they're doing somewhat a similar thing. And here, we have a whole different kind of scale, which is that we have a lot of somewhat uninvolved, and I mean operationally uninvolved, members. So let me use some examples. Let's say we have a large company, or like doing something very complex with a lot of pieces to it. Or for example, since that is going to be one of the talks at the conference today, town management, right? You would have a lot of big chunks and then down to a lot of detail covering a wide array of operations. Right, there's elder care, there's preschools, there's finance, there's this, and there's roads and sewage and whatever. A lot of things. So that would need scale, right? And that, I would say, is sometimes what people mean when they say, does sociocracy, or when they ask, does sociocracy scale? Then there's this kind, where we have a lot of similar circles, for example, regional circles. So for example, if you have franchises or something like that, or the organization that we sometimes quote as the biggest sociocratic organization, the Children's Parliaments, they have a lot of regional and kind of neighborhood-based chapters, and each of the neighborhoods is kind of doing the same thing, just somewhere else. That's what I mean by similar circles. So that's a whole different situation from that. Right, it's a different kind of scale. It's just in many more chapters. So while if we added more complexity here, it would be by going deeper, or by also covering, I don't know, agriculture in our town. Okay, here it would be adding another different area, like another region, but doing the same thing there. Then the other one is scale in this way, and that is having a lot of members. So the operations don't increase necessarily. It's just more people kind of being a part of it in whatever way. So for example, if you have a membership organization or something like a professional association, you might have 5 or 10,000, or I don't know, many more people that are members of something. It doesn't mean they're all in work circles. Or you can have, in the case of DAOs, you can have token holders, for those of you who know what that is. And for example, if people ask about running a town or like a country sociocratically, what they have in mind, I guess, is citizens. That's very different from this situation, because a citizen might or might not be in a work circle that runs the town. More likely it is that we don't need as many people in a work circle in a town to run the town as there are citizens. Unless we have a situation like that. So that's why I want to say there are also combinations of this, right? You can have a lot of complexity plus a regional structure with it, plus membership or citizens, like then it would be all combined. And that makes the whole question of does sociocracy scale really complex for me, because I want to ask in what way. So I'm going to look at each of those three a little bit more closely, just with a few issues that I've either seen or that one would expect, just to kind of think out loud, really, because there isn't that much experience with that. You know, it's not that we've studied this with like 20 large scale examples for many years. That's not the case. So I'm going to the first scenario now, where we have a lot of depth into many different circles, many different operations, many layers, and so on. And although we're not super big, you know, we're bigger than what many people have experience with. I mean, Sociocracy for All. These are some of the issues that we are already facing with our 200 members. So some of the design considerations, and I'll talk much more about that in my second part of the talk, is we have things that centralize and things that decentralize. So decentralization is kind of obvious in sociocracy, right? We have distributed authority. Each of these fractals holds a different nested domain. Like we go always deeper into that domain, and it's all clear, and subsidiarity principle applies, and it's all easy. There are some other models that are somewhat similar. For example, the Venn but higher users is also an interesting one, where each of the fractals is basically in competition to each other, or can be in competition. So if one of the circles doesn't want to use that sub-circle as an internal service, they're free to go somewhere else and buy that service. So that's an interesting one, even a little bit more decentralized maybe than sociocracy typically is when it comes out of the box. Then there are centralizing forces like information flow, right? There is information that we want all of them to have. And if they share one budget, if there's a big pot of money that gets distributed, then that is a centralizing force because there's one budget and we have to allocate it somehow. And with budget comes strategy, because the strategy informs where our priorities are in terms of budget allocation. So it has to be in some shape or form one conversation that leads to that. One conversation that sets the priorities. Or in a different way, and I'll talk about that. My slides always have a little bit of a lag. Okay. So what are some issues? Well, some issues that I know we see, and I project that would be the same, is a little bit of fragmentation. That once you have like 10 layers here, although double linking does a great job at connecting it, and the filter and amplify function of linking and so on, and yet it does, you know, like how many times can trust kind of extend itself through the layers? That's a little bit of a question. And one thing that I want to highlight, for example, is budget decisions, because that's not so obvious to people. So let's say they are asking for budget and they are asking for budget. Let's say each of the circles is making budget decisions for their child circles. Okay, like this circle would decide the budget for them. Let's say, and I know that from client work, let's say this is a fairly young organization, but still already somewhat at scale. And let's say these people want to hire an entire, like, let's say they want to create new staff roles. Okay, so they need a lot of money. Which, just for the sake of the argument, let's assume that this circle is now doubling their budget request. That would now come here and they would say, wow, that's a lot. We don't have that. Let's ask our parent circle. Now they go here and they say, oh, we don't, I mean, that's way beyond what we can decide. This needs to go here. Okay. So now the same thing happens from this side. Let's put a silly example on it, or not so silly. Let's say they want to have two full-time people that now do TikTok because it's the outreach department. And let's say they are doing something completely different. Like they want to translate the website into 3 new languages, okay? So now we sit here and we're trying to do our budget allocation. And there are these big requests that basically originate in specific circles. How is this circle going to make that decision? Because yes, there are links, but how much, let's imagine there's like several more layers, how much can we understand about our priorities between this versus that? And they are somewhat remote from that decision. So that's a tricky one that I have not really seen solved. There are some things I have to say about that, but in general, this is more to kind of show the problem space and to my talk. I don't necessarily want to talk so much about solutions because I think they depend so much. Just I want to advance the discussion so that we don't just talk about the superficial question of the sociocracy scale, but we have a little bit more to say. So possible solutions, a well thought out structure, I think, is always the first thing to go to here for me. Strong sense of purpose, identity and culture, good information flow, so that the sense making here can happen, but I'll talk more about that in a bit. Then still on the same kind of, no, actually, never mind, sorry, next. So now we have the what was in the middle earlier, when we had the 3 different kinds of structures. This would be the second one. So now, for example, national, regional, and local structures, or chapters. For example, if you look at an organization like Extinction Rebellion, they are worldwide, right? And they typically have a national chapter, they often have regional chapters, and then they have local chapters. And each of the chapters basically look somewhat similar. They will all have some outreach, something about organizing actions, something about organizing art, and so on. So that's just what they do, right? And so in this case, for example, we would have, let's say, New York City, Boston, and Washington, D.C. If this was like Extinction Rebellion East Coast in the US, then there might be a general circle, and then there might be everything that is kind of together, like let's say they share a budget, or they do fundraising together. So if then they would have something that is shared among all of them. But other than that, the inside of region A looks almost like the inside of region B and region C, because they're all doing similar things, just in different places. So, and then one thing that constantly needs to be negotiated in these scenarios is how much is here, how much is decided here, and how much is decided in the chapters. And that's not a trivial question at all, actually. And it's something that is very alive for these organizations, of who decides that. For example, let's say the social media strategy is set here. Do they say what gets posted and what we're going to focus on? Or does each region do their own thing? Very real questions. Okay. So possible issues, duplication of efforts. Like they develop, let's say they do like a 3-month process around their social media strategy. They do 2 and they do 2. Now we've done almost the same thing 3 times. And that's not only duplication, but it can also become incoherent. And I know from working with some of them that there's always the like, who's supporting us? Like how much does headquarters support region B? And this might be a complex circle structure itself. This would not be just, this is kind of a placeholder here for the circle structure that would be on the regional or the interregional level. Okay. And then possible solutions. There is a concept that we work with in SOFA, which is called a help desk, which is basically a domain agreement, let's say on social media. Let's say we have a social media circle here that is kind of the overarching social media circle that would now work out the social media strategy and support all the social media circles, and then the social media circles of those regions could check in here for help. It's a little bit like a help desk, really. It's the best description of it, like a help desk, but they are still autonomous. It's just that there's some shared service, and that is spelled out in help desk. And I have a whole slide on resources for you, so there's something written about that. Okay, what's next here? The third way of organizing, that was the one on the very right. So there we have many uninvolved members, completely different situation. And that happens in DAOs, in decentralized autonomous organizations. It happens in membership organizations, as I said, like professional associations. And it happens, for example, in platform co-ops, like think of a cooperatively owned platform. Like if the cooperative was running Twitter, then everybody who is a member of Twitter or like has an account at Twitter would like to have a little bit of a say. So how would that work? And one interesting thing for me is that membership now becomes its own membrane. So one joins, let's say, Twitter, okay, and I'm really thinking of a cooperatively owned counterpart of Twitter, but I'm using it as a reference point. So everybody who's a Twitter member, like me, I have a Twitter account, is a member, but that doesn't mean that I'm doing operations, right? I'm not working for Twitter. So let's see. So it would look like this. So there's the membership of people who are just members, and then there's the people who run the thing, the operators in a DAO. What's always a little tricky is the discussion on how much do they get to have a say, the members, and in what way. So for example, if you have a credit union, then that's the same situation. I'm a member of a credit union, but I don't work for the credit union. The Socratic model is really the strongest when it's worker run, not necessarily member run. And that is a difference in this case. So what we need to do is we need to debate, okay, what does that mean to be a member? And for example, it might just mean that you get to have a vote once a year on who's on the board. But that's actually breaking a little bit with Socratic principles, because it means that the board would not have consent on its membership. That's a whole other little thing about how to weave those two together. I just want to point out it's not so trivial. Again, it's really a lot of design questions. And for example, in the case of DAOs, there's always the discussion of the people who are token holders, which is basically like a membership. What do they get to vote on? Everything? Or do they get to hold a vote once a year? Or something in between, you know? But what's the domain that membership can have a say over? Or is it that they just give input and they don't really have a say? And that's all a big discussion. And that's also why I chose the word uninvolved, is because so often people say, oh, if you're a member, you get to be involved, but they don't really define of what involved means. Does it mean I get to do things? Does it mean I get to poke around a little bit on the Discord channel? Does it mean I get to have a vote? Does it mean I make decisions? What does it mean to be involved? And people are a little vague about that, and that gets us into all kinds of trouble from my point of view. Okay, so possible issues here: lack of feedback by operations or lack of informed input from the membership. So what happens is that, for example, in my case, I'm a member of the credit union, okay? So I get to have a vote, or let's say in my local food co-op, I'm a member, and then once a year I get a ballot, right? And there's names that I have no clue who they are. Never met these people, never heard of these people, but somehow I'm supposed to vote on them, right? And if that's how it works, then I am making, as a member, I'm making a decision, I'm casting a vote with basically zero information. But if you do it the other way, and members are very informed and decide everything, then you can have a situation where the board and the membership runs a thing, but not the staff, who really know what needs to be done. So that's a big tension for me that I would like to see resolved ultimately. And that also points already to the distinction here. So if scale means that we're gonna have 200,000 members and 20 people run the thing that we are members of, I want to know how that relates. And then the question is not, does sociocracy scale? The question is, do we have a coherent story about how we include our membership in decision making? Because this would just run very normally, but that's not where the scale is. The scale is here. And just to be super clear about that one, because that also gets mixed up. So this would be where decision making is, right? With workers or workers, whether they're paid or not, I don't care. It's just people who are doing the work operationally are decision makers, and it's a Socratic, like in sort of pure sociocratic system, then feedback comes from the outside, including the membership, and we might have communities of practice. So sometimes people say, oh, we have all kinds of, let's say, mutual support circles that meet. In every region, we have mutual support circles that meet. So therefore we have that in every district, and therefore we have 200,000 members. So yeah, that's sweet, but these are not circles. They're just communities of practice because they don't make decisions for the organization. They're just meeting. So that's another really key distinction. If we talk about scale, often scale is here, not here. So to me, that's not a question of the sociocracy scale. The question here is, how do you communicate with your communities of practice and keep that coherent? So a little bit of a distraction there. All right, another thing that can lead to scale, that is kind of the edge of what I'm loving to think about right now, is can there be scale through inter-organizational collaboration? So this is always a little bit of a placeholder for me for a sociocratic organization. Okay, now we have 3. Could we reach scale by having 3, like some kind of superorganism or some way to connect these? And what happens quite a bit is that we have organizations that are like, wow, I love what you guys are doing, and and you guys love what we're doing. Okay, let's do something together is typically the sentence that gets said then. But let's do something together is as unspecific as, oh, we should have many more people involved, like involve and let's do something together, a little bit of trigger phrases to me, because they mean nothing, because now how are we going to do something together? Let's say this is us, okay? If I put myself into the shoes here, this is sofa, and somebody says, let's do something together. Okay, but there we have another organization with the same level of complexity. Does that mean this circle is doing something with this? Or does it mean this department is going to work with this department? Like, what does this even mean? Does it mean we're running one event together? Does it mean we merge our organizations? Something in between? Tell me what. And when I'm feeling a little snarky about it, I sometimes say, let's do something together is to me as naive as saying, oh, we both have a thumb. Great, let's join forces. But you can't join forces in that way. I can't use your thumb just like you can't use our finance department. That just doesn't work that way. Because we're one organism, you can't just take pieces out of it. It just doesn't work that way. So, and I have a few thoughts on that, but I'll get to that. So then what people typically go to is, oh yeah, that's how inter-organizational collaboration looks, and kind of a hub structure or a collective impact structure. And that's all great. And yes, that works, but it's not super exciting quite yet, unless they have a really strong and well-funded core, which of course does something. It's interesting, but I want to think about more options still. One interesting thing in these patterns is that there's always a little bit of a tension of how much can this hub, if we want to call it that, decide, how much can they rule into these organizations. So if this is an organization and the hub now decides all the partner organization need to give 10% of their budget into the hub, can they just decide that? What if they say no? Or what if they say we're going to run a conference together and the outreach team for this organization says no? How's that going to look? Like, how do we interact with an organization that is distributed and has autonomy in each of its parts? It's not a trivial question. Could also look a little bit like that. That would be more sociocratic of a thing, where we have double linking, and we would have to have clarity on what the domains are. So for example, can this group decide that there's going to be a conference and that 10% of each of these organizations would go into the big pot? So that is a domain question then. But that's possible, of course. And then with a little bit more complexity, these are all pictures from Many Voices, One Song from a book. Now we would have organizations that are basically acting like work circles. So let's say we have a marketing organization that is operating as our marketing circle. That's also interesting. Now, again, it can lead to a little bit of friction or just lack of clarity on who does what. Let's say the marketing organization here is doing a thing with these people. Now, who's gonna be in charge of putting that shared event or something that they do together? Who's putting it on the website? Who's paying for that? How does that all work? Like, it's the devil is in the detail very much in those things. It all sounds easy, and then when you sit down and do it, it's actually very complicated. All right, another thing, just playing a little bit, and I'm almost done, by the way, or like, no, maybe another 6 or 7 slides here. I wanted to show this because let's say these are organizations now. This is coming from an article that I wrote a few months or weeks ago. Let's say these are autonomous organizations, and we're not trying to build a super organization. There is no entity above all of them. What we're trying to do is we're trying to do cross connections. So for example, we could say, oh, we make a promise to this organization and this organization, let's say this is us, and we promise this organization that they will always have a seat on our mission circle, and also them and them. That's possible. But it's also very superficial, right? Because it doesn't mean that operationally we're doing anything together. What I've thought about quite a bit is the following pattern of, could we maybe focus more on these cross connection by having a protocol by which we can have a collaboration hosted by one of the circles. So for example, this organization has some sort of project that will then have a circle here that say this is the project and this is the circle, and they can now invite people into it and to collaborate and be a decision maker here. And what I worked on is, what are the basic agreements one would have to make in order to do that, and you can look at that here. So that's, I think, an interesting way. And then to me, what happens when we start playing with that and we become really good at that is that it's not so much that we're building super organisms, but more that we're building tissue, connective tissue between organizations. So let me show that. So as you can tell, I stole that from the internet. So if we go from cells to tissue to organ systems to organisms, what comes next, right? So you and I are an organism. Now we can form a team. Now we can form a team of teams. That's an organization. And now what's a organization of organizations? And many times I see people go into this direction, which I think is exciting. I'm not against that at all. But I also want to talk more about, could we talk about it more in terms of tissue? Maybe we're trying to jump a step, you know, if we're going from organization to organizations to organizations. Maybe there's something in between that we're kind of going too fast, I think. But that's just a little bit of impulse for people to think about. All right, so ironically, the last few months, I've thought about centralization more than I've thought about decentralization, because I know how to decentralize. That's easy with sociocracy. What is harder is how to centralize in a distributed system. And that is a little bit of an unpopular opinion, because I think people are so excited to decentralize that they throw the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. And sociocracy has both, right? But people kind of pick up on the decentralization first, because that's the new thing, right? Any hierarchical system is centralized, so that's not the exciting piece at first for people. So, but I'm excited about centralization in a decentralized context and in a consent-based context. So what I mean by that is there are pieces that we need to have coherence about. And to me, those are the 3. And I'm open to hearing that there's others that I'm missing, but those are the 3 that I'm aware of. Strategy and budget and information. I've already alluded to it, but let me say more now. So information flow is the first one on this slide. If we have large scale organizations, information flow becomes a humongous bottleneck. There's just too much information. People don't even have the time to take it in. So if people are excited about scaling, I worry about how are they going to manage information flow. because I don't think we're so good at that yet. You know, and you can't solve the information flow system by saying, oh, let's just have a Slack channel or a Discord channel or whatever it might be. You know, like, it's still going to be overwhelming. There's still going to have to be a lot of maintenance and synthesis and kind of digesting the information and curating it. And it's also really hard to summarize like the depth. Have one little example. If you sometimes people do that, let's say you have like this whole deep session of some sort of visioning and you or sense making, and then you write all your insights onto sticky notes and you think, oh great, now I can just put into people's heads what I have in my head by sharing the sticky notes with them. Unfortunately, they read the sticky notes and they just shrug because they didn't go through the deep process that led to those results, right? So sharing sticky notes or like the sense making it needs more than just sharing your results, right? And people often stop there, and I just find it not very satisfactory. So we need to find ways of doing sense making for real, and I don't have any brilliant idea. So if you have one, I would absolutely love to hear it, because I think it's holding us back big time. So that is a problem we will have to solve. Very hard to maintain, and I'm saying, okay, technical solutions are maybe somewhat possible, but with limits, right? But I think it's still manageable. Maybe it's just that one has to throw a lot of resources into people who digest and spit it out again in a digestible format. So maybe that's somehow on its way, but I think we all have to learn to do that better and to pay more attention to it, to prioritize it more. And then budget and strategy, as I said, we need to have a somewhat coherent story that is shared if we share budget. Otherwise, we don't know how we make our budget decisions. And people are very unsure often of what strategy is. The way I explain it to people is that if you have an organism, let's say, you know, my body, the lungs are doing its thing, right? The heart is doing its thing and everything else. So everything works. But let's say I get scared, okay, because something just happened. Now there's this rush of hormones through my body, right, that is putting each and every response to it in alert position. And then every piece of my body knows what to do. Like the heart will beat faster, right? Breathing changes and so on. So that is basically what strategy is. Let's say your organization is going bankrupt. Each and every part needs to kick into action and focus on that. That's what strategy is, right? Or it might be, of course, a positive aim, you know, a positive strategy of something like, hey, let's, I don't know, whatever it might be. Let's sell twice as what we have been paying last year. Okay, so that goes then into prioritization. Who decides that? Who decides the priorities? Like, do the lungs decide? Does the brain decide? What if the lungs object? How does that happen? And then another issue that goes along with that, that is somewhat related to the information thing, is, so I'm sorry for the jumping. So I think we can't really solve that with technical solutions, because I don't want to vote about strategies, honestly, because there's a lot of thinking and sense making that needs to go into that. I think voting is not going to be a thing. And also, again, just a shared document or whatever it might be will not suffice to, it doesn't replace a proper strategy on how to make strategy. It's just a tool, but it's not a pattern yet that we can use. And then, well, I'll talk about that in a moment, actually. Sorry. Around strategy, there's also this interesting piece that I would love to see how we could do that better, because the more concrete circles, they will have information about strategy, right? Let's say your strategy is to sell twice as many products in 2023. They would have some good ideas about that. So you want to hear your concrete circles about it, and also everything in between. So it might go direct to wherever strategy is held, or it might go in between steps, probably both. And then you also want to communicate strategy top down. And the whole thing, ideally, in a perfect world, it would go into both directions all the time. A little bit like breathing, breathe in, breathe out. but on what cycle? Through what mechanisms? How do we do it? Tricky one. And then last thing before I summarize here, the level of detail. So if we make a strategy that says we focus on expansion in this quarter or in this year, okay, that sounds great, and it can be in a really pretty PowerPoint slide. Okay, that's what we're doing. Terrific. But what does that now mean for my 50 to-do tasks on the to-do list? Which one is now first? You know, like it just is not so trivial to people to translate an overarching strategy into, okay, now what does it mean? What if now two things are still both very important? It just doesn't, I mean, it solves the problem, but it's still not easy or trivial. So that between the glossy, beautiful sounding strategy and my to-do list, there's somehow something that needs to connect it in a different way and tell me the story of now what does that mean. So summary. I think we need to be more specific. You've heard me say that. What kind of scale do we want? What do we want to scale? Is it operations, membership, chapters, or the people impacted or supported or whatever it might be? I think decentralization via sociocracy is great, but we also think more about the centralizing aspects, the sense making, the alignment, the coherence, and which aspects deserve more focus on decentralization and which ones deserve more centralization. And to me, that's one big design challenge that I'm pretty interested in. Last slide is just some of the things that I'm quoting there. So you have that.